All right, so are you ready for this? We're going deep today, really deep, into the Congo's fight for
This
independence.
should be fascinating, yeah.
We got a really interesting mix of sources for this one, by the way.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Textbook stuff, of course, but also speeches from the time. Even a little peek at how some of those tiny island nations are doing it these days,
Can
independence-wise.
you give some perspective? Yeah.
I think so, because talk about a moment in history. It's like everything's shifting. Speaking of which, let's jump right in with Patrice Lumumba, all right? June 30th, 1960, the independence speech.
A powerful moment.
It's more than just a speech, though, right? It's like a declaration. This whole nation, they're on the edge of something huge.
Lumumba, he was the prime minister, newly elected at that point. He really captured the mood, you know, the hope, but also everything the Congo had been through under colonial rule.
Decades, right?
Decades, yeah. And his words, they resonated way beyond just the Congo. This was huge.
You can practically hear it in the text we've got right here, like echoes of history. He even says, wounds still too recent and painful.
Wow.
And then he lists them out plain as day. Forced labor, inequality, violence, the whole 9 yards. He does not hold back.
That's what makes it so powerful, though. He's not shying away from the tough stuff. These were real lived experiences for people.
It wasn't some abstract thing for them, was it?
Not at all. This was their daily life he was talking about.
Yeah.
Being paid less than they needed to survive, the humiliation, the brutality, having their land just taken, and then this turn.
Like a punch to the gut, I bet.
He just comes out and says, all that is finished. And boom, the Republic of the Congo is born. Like that. A new nation in charge of its own destiny.
You have to wonder what it felt like to be there. All those people, the hope, but also the uncertainty, right?
It's almost impossible for us to imagine now.
Yeah.
But that moment, the weight of history, the expectations, it had to be overwhelming.
And that's where things get even more interesting, because we've got Lumumba talking about freedom, self-determination, this whole new chapter.
Right.
But then you look at what actually happened, what our textbook sources are saying, and it's a different story.
Not so simple, no. Because Belgium, they weren't just going to walk away, were they?
It had been in control for so long.
Exactly. So even though they granted independence on paper, these excerpts argue that behind the scenes, Belgium was absolutely trying to keep their grip on power.
And they weren't exactly subtle about it either.
Oh no, this was a calculated move. The textbook, it lays it all out. They played on existing tensions, turned groups against each other, a classic tactic, but effective.
Divide and conquer, right?
Exactly. Make it harder for any kind of unified resistance to get a foothold.
And of course, the Congo had all those incredible resources. Belgium wasn't going to just let go of that, were they?
Not a chance.
Yeah.
Especially Katanga province, right? All those minerals, that was a huge part of it.
So we've got this independence movement, this incredible moment of hope.
Right.
But at the same time, you've got all this maneuvering going on behind the scenes, the Cold War starting to heat up, corporations circling like sharks.
It's all connected, isn't it? Like a powder keg waiting to explode.
Yeah. And this is just the beginning. So how did they do it? I mean, if Belgium was supposedly like out of the picture, how did they keep pulling the strings?
Well, it was subtle. You know, nothing as obvious as sending in troops. Instead, they focused on making sure the Congo couldn't get its act together.
By stirring the pot. Didn't we see that somewhere in the sources?
Absolutely. They basically took advantage of the fact that the Congo's a diverse place, lots of different ethnic groups, and Belgium, they just poured gasoline on those little fires, you know?
Create some chaos, make it harder to govern.
Exactly. It's much easier to hold on to power when everyone's busy fighting amongst themselves. And then you get to swoop in, the great peacekeepers, looking out for everyone's best interests.
Except their own, right? Because let's not forget about all that mineral wealth, especially down in Katanga.
Oh yeah, Katanga. That was key. We were talking earlier about how international players were already starting to circle.
During the Cold War and all that.
Exactly. And Belgium, along with some very powerful mining companies, they had a lot to lose if things changed too much.
So suddenly, letting go completely didn't seem like such a good idea after all.
Right. It became less about holding on to direct control and more about maintaining their economic interests, making sure those resources kept flowing no matter who was officially running the country.
Talk about a power move, right? Just shifting tactics like that.
Oh, for sure. And this is where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. Because Depending on how you look at it, you get different interpretations. Our textbook calls this historiography, right?
Right, different ways of seeing the same events, like with those examples they gave, materialism versus cultural history, I think it was.
Exactly. Materialism, that's all about the economics. So a materialist historian, they'd be looking at, say, who profited from Belgium's actions, how money influenced their decisions. Follow the money, and you'll understand the history.
Makes sense to me.
Right. Cultural history, though, that takes a different approach.
Mm.
It's less about the big picture and more about everyday life.
Yeah.
How did regular people experience these events? What stories did they tell themselves about what was happening?
So, like, the human side of it all.
Exactly. And when you apply those different lenses to someone like Patrice Lumumba, his legacy,
Right.
it becomes much more than just a simple story.
Oh, I bet. So how would they see him, the materialist historians versus the cultural historians?
Well, a materialist might focus on Lumumba's push for economic independence, trying to nationalize industries, take back control of the Congo's resources from foreign companies, that kind of
He
thing.
did seem pretty passionate about that, yeah.
He was. A cultural historian, though, might be more interested in his impact on, like, Congolese identity, how his speeches got people fired up about the future, his vision of this Pan-African movement that really resonated at the time.
So it was like two sides of the same coin, both important for understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly. And it really highlights how history isn't just about facts, right? It's about interpretation. Who's doing the telling, what perspective they're coming from.
Makes you wonder how much we miss by only getting one side of the story. Speaking of which, we haven't even touched on those micronation examples you found. Seems like a bit of a jump, but I'm curious.
It is a bit of a contrast, isn't it? We've been talking about the Congo, this huge country, all these resources, and all the problems that came with them.
Right, and now we're going to look at what? Tiny islands? Some of them barely even on the map. How do they even work? It's wild, right? Like you've got the Congo, this massive place bursting with resources, and then these tiny island nations barely bigger than a postage stamp, and they're making it work.
It is pretty amazing when you think about it. They've had to be really strategic, playing to their strengths.
So how do they do it? What's their secret?
Well, take a place like Palau, for example.
Hmm.
Absolute stunning natural beauty, incredible underwater ecosystems. So they've really leaned into tourism.
Makes sense. Capitalize on what makes them unique.
Exactly. They've positioned themselves as this kind of exclusive ecotourism destination. And because they're so small, they can really control the impact, make sure it's sustainable.
So it's like turning their size into an advantage.
Right. And then you've got places like St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now, they've gone a different route. They're known for their specialized agriculture, particularly bananas. Turns out those volcanic soils they've got are perfect for it.
So they found their niche, something they can excel at.
And they've managed to compete in the global market, even against those huge agricultural giants. It makes you wonder, about the Congo. What if things had been different?
What if they'd had the chance to find their own path, like these micronations?
Exactly. What if, instead of being caught in the middle of all those Cold War power struggles, they'd have been given the space and support to develop their own unique economic models?
It's hard not to think about, the what ifs of history, all that potential.
It really makes you appreciate that there isn't just one way to be independent, to be successful. It looks different for every nation.
For sure. But those choices, those paths available, they're not always obvious, are they? Especially when you've got powerful forces at play, like in the Congo's case.
Right, the legacy of colonialism, the Cold War, economic interests, it all adds up. But that's why it's so important to examine these events, to learn from them.
To get those different perspectives, like we've been doing today.
Exactly. Because understanding the Congo's struggle, it's not just about the past, is it? It helps us make sense of the world today, the challenges nations are still facing all over the globe.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? Lumumba, Belgium's not-so-subtle tactics, even those tiny island nations finding their way.
And through it all, I think the big takeaway is that history, it's more complex than we often give it credit for.
Definitely. And more relevant than ever, I'd say.
Absolutely. So keep asking those questions, keep digging deeper. You never know what connections you might find.
I love that. All right, everyone, that's it for our deep dive today. But like we always say, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into history's most fascinating moments.